So it is my great pleasure to introduce the two speakers of this afternoon. And first of all, we are going to start with John Borland, who is recently retired from his position as an archaeological and architectural surveyor, first at the Royal Commission and then at HES, and who is the president of the Pictish Art Society. And his paper today will discuss the newfound Conan stone within the Easter Ross group of monuments.
Thank you very much, Anouk. So it's a pleasure to be with you all today. And before I start, I'd like to say I am so relieved that we have people with the expertise of Graciela and her team. Otherwise, we would not be celebrating the restoration and display of this wonderful stone. And I'm so pleased that she was able to join us, that amazing story with us. So thank you, Graciela. So yes, today I'm going to be looking at the Conan stone in the context of Pictish northern slabs in northern Scotland. I spoke about the Conan stone at the Highland Archaeology Conference in October 2019. And I made the point that it had little or to do with its near neighbours in Easter Ross, but it had strong thematic and stylistic connections with South Pictland. And it's only fair to say that this analysis did not sit well with the expert opinion in the room. So today, with a little bit more time available to us, we're going to examine the other Pictish cross slabs, not just in Easter Ross, but also Caithness and Sutherland, to look for thematic and stylistic parallels. Anyone with a passing interest in Pictish sculpture will, I'm sure, be familiar with Romilly Allen's classification system. I have to say I'm not a fan. I think it's a deeply flawed system and it's long past its sell-by date. But in the absence of an accepted alternative, I will use it. But don't mistake this for enthusiasm on my part. So, of course, the Conan stone has a cross, it's carved in relief, it has ornament, it has figurative carving, and those all-important Pictish symbols, so that makes it a class. But for the purpose of this paper this afternoon, I'm going to be looking at both the class 2 and the class 3 stones. And that's because I don't believe we should fall into the trap that's implicit in Allen's classification system that sees 1, then 2, then 3 as a developmental sequence. We shouldn't fall into the trap of believing that all class 3 stones post-date all class 2 stones. I don't believe that for a minute. So potentially we might find contemporary parallels in ornament and figurative themes, obviously not in symbols, but in other aspects of the stone. So we'll be looking at both of these classes today. And here we go, starting with Caithness, the assemblage there. And you can see it's at a glance, it's quite a diverse corpus. The stones themselves look quite varied in shape and size and form, but within this we can start to see quite a lot of connecting themes. We can see equal arm crosses set on pedestals. To that we can add a cross of arcs on a pedestal. Many of the crosses there are rising from square or rectangular bases, so there's a lot of themes connecting this diverse group of stones. With these two stones, Skinnet 1 and Latham 1, we can see very close in proportion and in format and in style. Cross occupies the same percentage of the face, incised Pictish symbols below that. So, you know, really quite strong local connections there. And with these two samples, we can see virtually identical ornament. They were found not that far apart, and I wonder, in fact, whether the small Dounreay fragment is the sliver of stone that was removed from the Ray cross slab in the 1700s when a later burial inscription was added into the head of the cross. That later burial inscription, of course, was then later removed in an act of vandalism to try and take away for the reuse. But, you know, that could actually be part of the same stone. If not, it shows very similarly themed ornament. In terms of connection to the Conan stone, Skinnet 1, we've got these hybrid sea creatures with the spiral tails. flanking across here, but in terms of form, they're not particularly close to the skinnet, to the Conan example, and also they are forming it. I think performing a very different function here. They flank across, and their snouts become part of the interlace that fills across. So I think we've got a very different sort of function going on here. On the Ulster stone, we have a closer example of the hybrid sea creature. So that's worth a closer look, and we'll come back to look at that in detail subsequently. Also on the Ulster stone, we've got two people kneeling either side of a cauldron, and that again gives us a possible tantalizing connection. So we'll come back to look at that in closer detail further on. Moving on to Sutherland, we can see this is a slightly smaller corpus, but it's equally varied in size and form. Arguably, I think it's more accomplished than the Caithness material, so maybe that indicates a closer tie and connection with an established school of sculpture. Maybe we've got connections between this and the schools, the bigger assemblages in Easter Ross, possibly. To my surveyor's eye, I don't necessarily view this in the way that an art historian would, but to my surveyor's eye, I don't see any strong interconnecting themes in terms of ornament, figurative carving, style like this. So I don't see that at all. And interestingly, I don't really see any strong interconnecting themes with the Caithness corpus. It seems to be very different. So perhaps, as I said, with this being arguably a little bit more accomplished, maybe this is looking south to its influence, and the Caithness is more remote, more independent. And importantly, I really don't see any strong interconnecting themes with the Conan stone here either. On this stone, we do have this from Galsby. We've got this chap walking with an axe, and the axe is of a similar form to the axe that's held by the centaur on the Conan stone. So we can look at that again, but it's not a precedent for an interconnection here. Moving on to Easter Ross, we start with the big independent standing monuments, which themselves represent some of the finest examples of Pictish sculpture. The cross slab at Nig, an amazing masterpiece, but nothing there that really connects it artistically, thematically, stylistically with Conan, not to my eye. Same with Shandwick, again, another masterpiece of carving, but nothing particularly strongly connecting it with Conan. Like Conan, it has a double disc filled with spirals, but as we will see when we look closer at the Conan stone later on, it's not a particularly close parallel. And on that figurative panel, on the reverse of Shandwick, we do have cattle. I think personally they are two bulls. I think they've got that little bit something extra that makes them bulls rather than cows, not particularly closely related to what we see on the Conan stone. Hiltner Cadboll, the third major independently standing piece in Easter Ross, magnificent achievement, but nothing there to my eye suggesting any artistic connection with the Conan stone. We have an assemblage at Rosemarkie. This is the big cross slab, which again, truly amazing masterpiece, but nothing strongly connecting to Conan, nor with any of the other smaller pieces from Rosemarkie. There's a large assemblage at Port Mahomack. Unfortunately, it's thoroughly illustrated and recorded pictorially, but we'll pick our way through some of them. So here we can see with this fragment from Port Mahomack, very strong connection linking it stylistically to the Hilton Cadwell stone, both in theme and in ornament and in style. That's showing a very definite link there. If I use my cursor to highlight, the symbols on this fragment are small on this narrow edge of the stone, and we have a serpent and zed-rod, but it's in a totally different format and totally different style to what we have on the Conan stone. Another small fragment from Port Mahomet shows potential stylistic links with aspects on the Shandwick stone, linking it into that one. And on another tiny fragment from Port Mahomet, showing a kind of stylistic link with some of the bosses on the next stone. And indeed, going beyond the Tarbert Peninsula, we can see with this sample from Port Mahomet with 3 sunken crosses, it kind of tunes in with the cross slab with a sunken cross at its base from Rosemarkie. So visually, we've got similarities between these. And in fact, we can even trace a fragment from Port Mahomet that's got a parallel right the way down to St Andrews, potentially, in a strongly similar theme on the back of one of the smaller cross slabs, suggesting maybe that we've got a sea link right down the east coast of Scotland, which is not unlikely, frankly. Port Mahomet's been described as the beating Christian heart of the Tarbert Peninsula. And we can certainly see tangible connections with its sculpture and with the stones at Hilton, Cadwell, Shandwick and Nigg. And those influences extend beyond the Tarbert Peninsula to Rosemarkie. So although the Conan stone isn't on that peninsula, it's not unreasonable, I think, to expect that influence to have extended inland a little bit, to have had some kind of mark on the Conan stone. But to my surveyor's eye, I just don't think such a connection is there at all. It's been argued that although it's incomplete, the Conan stone was probably tall and narrow in its proportions. I've done a conjectural reconstruction there on the left-hand side to show its likely or possible proportions. And so it's been argued that we have the tall narrow model on Easter Ross, and indeed we've seen it in the other 2 counties that we've looked at, in Caithness and Sutherland. It's a common thing, and it's true, they have that in common. But the tall narrow model is not the defining aspect of Northern Cross slabs. They come in all shapes and sizes, and equally the tall narrow model is found really quite widespread throughout Pictland. Here we've got examples from Aberdeenshire, the Maidenstone, Cossins from Angus, and Crieff cross slab from Perthshire. So for me, the tall narrow connection is there, but it's not a persuasive argument that influence necessarily. It's also been argued that the Conan stone has full width symbols, as do its near neighbours in Easter Ross, the Shandwick and Rosemarkie. And again, that is true, they all have that in common, but those full width symbols are not ubiquitous to Easter Ross. We've got very different ones, as we've seen, and nor are they limited to it. We would find them throughout Pictland. This is an example from Aberlendo down in Angus. So again, for me, I don't think that's a particularly persuasive argument that this influence is a nearby influence. But I do think that we can see some thematic and stylistic connections with southern Pictland. The later inscription on the Conan stone partly obliterates the top symbol, but I'm pretty certain that we are looking at a serpent and zed-rod. And if we are, then it has quite distinctive proportions. It's short but broad, broad to fill that full width of the slab in that form. And we see a similar example carved in shallow relief on St Martin's stone down in Angus. And an even closer parallel on the Borestone of Gask from Perthshire. And note that this one, the Perthshire one, also the serpent there has a tightly curled tail at the very end, as we have surviving on the Conan stone. The Conan stone's double discs each are filled with 3 interlocking spirals. I find virtually the same ornament on the St Orland stone at Costonstown in Angus, and in fact the 2 double discs and the Z rods with that interconnecting bar between the discs are really very, very close in style, much closer those than any of the double discs and Z rods, or even the double discs without Z rods that are up in Easter Ross or that area. We looked at the hybrid sea creature. We've had a couple of examples of that up in Caithness. So here on the left, we have the little one from the Ulster stone, which is mirror image of quite close to the one, but it's in its snout than the Conan one is. And arguably, I think we can find a parallel for them with the one images, but they're really quite similar in profile, ear and sort of very canine looking snout. So we have a potential connection there going north, but this hybrid creature with the spiral tail is actually quite a widespread motif. And to be honest, I haven't found any example that's closely paralleled in the shape of the head with the Conan stone. It really is quite different from anything else that's gone around. The kneeling swordsman holding a shield, sword and shield, with the animal mask, the sort of dog or monkey mask, and the ponytail. Again, it's a mirror image, but that is virtually identical to the one from Murphley. Sorry, I've put Angus there in my caption, but it should be Perthshire. Very, very close. And hitherto, the one from Murphley was the only previously known example of this motif. So that draws a very strong parallel with southern Perthshire. Of course, we have to be careful not to infer too much from that. The Murphley one was unique, now it isn't, so we don't know what is yet to be found, we don't know what we've lost, but based on the evidence we have, strong connection with looking south. Moving on to the centaur, this one wielding 2 axes. There are no northern counterparts. The nearest centaur is the Maidenstone in Aberdeenshire, and it's not remotely similar stylistically. The human head part of it is seen in profile, and it has no arms, it's not holding axes. But we can find very close parallels to this one down in the south, this one on the Glamsman stone in Angus, and perhaps arguably even closer is this one from Beagle in Perthshire. And again, he's holding virtually identical axes in the style of axe. We're on the Galsby stone, but as I said earlier, that's a fairly minor detail. I wouldn't particularly find that a persuasive argument to connect the two in terms of a likely source of influence. The Ulster stone, we also saw a cauldron and people kneeling either side of it, and that's a kind of tantalising similarity with the Conan stone, but although the Ulster stone is incredibly weathered and worn, I'm pretty certain that neither of the kneeling figures has an animal mask, a sword, or a shield. So I don't think it is actually a close parallel to this. And arguably for a closer parallel, if we look at the cauldron that's on the Glam's Manstone again, it is supported on a stand as the Conan stone one seems to be. So again, I think we're looking to the south for strong influences. Cattle rock, quite a widespread motif, and we do have local examples. The two at the top there are the two bulls facing off in on the Shandwick stone, and below we have the calf stone from Port Mahomet. Neither, to my eye, pose a strong parallel, but for an almost exact match, we find an on face ox at the bottom of the Cosson stone in Angus. So again, looking to the south for parallels, for close parallels. To my eye, many of the symbols that appear on Class 2 stones when they're carved in relief undergo a certain degree of change from their Class 1 counterparts. Just one example, this becomes this, and I'm not saying the latter is in any way bad, but they do lose something in translation as they move from Class 1 to Class 2. Many of them do. They lose a little bit of that graphic clarity, that graphic purity, that just become a little bit, I don't know, just not quite the same. And I think you can see that transition on most, if not all, of the symbols from the Easter Ross stones. If you use these as a template to carve an incised version, those Pictish beasts, that eagle, that double disc with the tiny Z rod, none of them would make classic Class 1 symbols, frankly, in my opinion. They have moved on to become a kind of different thing. Now, this is a subjective matter, I suppose, but to my eye, I don't think the symbols on the Conan stone are quite so far down that road of change. I think it's difficult, obviously, with the serpent and Z rod because it's mostly not there. This is closer to its classic form that you would find on a Class 1 stone. As I say, this is subjective. Other people might not see this difference at all, but to my eye, these ones are not as far down that road of change. So perhaps that is confirmation of influence coming from elsewhere and not from the Easter Ross school of sculpture. Perhaps it suggests that the sculptor of the Conan of a slightly earlier date. I don't know, that's one for art historians to ponder and argue about. Moving on to face A of the Conan stone, beasts flanking the cross, they're more often than not hybrid sea creatures. They're not uncommon, they're quite widespread. Here we've got Moray, Aberdeenshire, Perthshire. But we have nothing like this cropping up in any of the Pictish stones anywhere. These really are quite unique, these two animals, whether they're dragons or dragonesque, or whether they represent something real, they really are in a class of their own. My thanks to Anna Ritchie for drawing this to my attention, this Anglo-Saxon architectural fragment from Deerhurst in Gloucestershire. It's dated to the first half of the 9th century. I don't think we can necessarily draw a connection between the two. I'll leave that to art historians if they feel, but it's certainly in terms of its monumentality, and kind of overall chunkiness is it's the closest parallel that visually that I can find. But as I say, I'm not sure that I would necessarily argue that one has a direct link to the other. It's worth noting the attention to detail on the Conan stones, the beasts, and to their teeth. Jagged, pointy teeth are not uncommon in these creatures that inhabit Pictish stones. They're generally shown just generic and pointy to give the impression of a fierce monster. But we have some anatomical accuracy here. The Conan stone beasts have incisors, canines, and molars. So even if they are fantastical beasts, the sculptor was working from some anatomical model of a real animal's teeth, I think. So the beasts actually emerge from the margin that surrounds the cross slab, and that margin itself connects in to the margin that runs round the cross. So they're connected to and coming from the cross. That might be a useful thing in terms of interpreting what they represent. So rather than being anything bad and demonic, I think they probably represent the forces that the cross that God can command. And each beast is biting the tail of, or perhaps regurgitating, a serpent. The cross itself, the ornament, much of it is badly weathered and worn. Interesting to see what we think in terms of whether upright or whether most of it, and I think most of it is probably due to the fact that this is the face that it lay face down on, and this is the face that's got wet and dry and wet and dry, and has sort of mouldered away in the ground. But we can see that it's been ornamented in all the quadrants of the cross and all parts of the cross. The roundel, I think, maybe has interlocking spirals and peltas. The example in the bottom left-hand quadrant of the cross, we've got this zoomorphic creature sort of biting its own tail. And then in the bottom right-hand quadrant, we've got a much tighter interwoven panel. But again, that too could potentially be zoomorphic. It might have an animal's head connected to it. The interlace on the narrow sides are quite different from anything nearby. And in fact, they're quite different from anything anywhere, really, in their sort of monumentality. There's really large, bold, interlace that runs down. But I did find quite with this tightly interwoven, it kind of looks like key pattern, but it is actually interwoven. So there's a little detail. I will move my cursor. There's a little detail on it that's down here that suggests that this too could be a zoomorphic feature on it. But interesting parallel down to St Andrews. So to sum up, to my eye, the Conan stone still has very little in common with its near neighbours in Easter Ross, or indeed into Sutherland or Caithness. I think some of its features have very close parallels in southern Pictland, suggesting that its sculptor, its creator, was at very least familiar with some of those monuments further south, and that he was creating it independently and separate from influence from anything nearby, perhaps, as I said, at an earlier date than the major church establishments on the coast. but much of it, and I think that's an important thing, and that's to cross slabs that we've looked at today. We can connect aspects of some of them with other stones, but more often than not, these things are really quite unique rather than mass-produced, and it is a timely reminder of the Picts' capacity for just individual creativity and not churning out repetitions and copies. It's been an absolute pleasure and privilege to be involved with the rescue of this stone. As Anne's video at the very beginning, when it was discovered, it could not be claimed as treasure trove. It could not be removed by any means of conventional means of that. So for NOSAS to take on the project really was the thing that saved it. But it has been a real team effort between NOSAS and the Pictish Art Society. Kirsty Cameron, the regional archaeologist, played a pivotal role in pulling everybody's resources and efforts together. The landowner, we couldn't have done any of it without his permission. Graciela and her team, in terms of the very, very expert conservation that they carried out, and everyone, every individual and every organisation, the crowdfunding appeal, a fantastic project to be involved in, and it's an immense sense of pleasure that something that could have been left mouldering in the ground was saved and is now on display. I'm ahead of schedule, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John, for this fantastic presentation. And I can see that there's already quite a lot of questions awaiting you in the Q&A. So I will start because you are a fantastic speaker, finished way early of time. So now we have plenty of time for question and discussion. And yeah, I'm sure that it's going to keep going. So I will start right away. With the question from Lorna, who says that the side panels are similar to the Jordan Hill cross in Govan, and the flanking beast with double beast interlace also similar to the sunstone in Govan. What are your thoughts on those similarities?
Well, I can see where she's coming from in that. The interlace, the Govan sculpture in the Govan school is well, Clyde built is the euphemism that's usually given to it. It's very bold and chunky. And in that sense, that very big, bold interlace that runs down the narrow edges of Conan, you could see a parallel with that. And I suppose, yes, the big sort of oversized snakes that evolve out of the spiral and the sunstone are quite reminiscent, some of that. But I think that's just, I think it's the boldness there that is what they have in common rather than a direct artistic connection. That would be my analysis on that.
Yeah, I was before moving on to the next question, I was going to say there's a lot of things as well that for me were reminiscent of this ensemble in Meagle with this very strong beast presence, but this two very TV beasts, that's more thinking of the hogbacks down south rather than the other type of element that we find here. But yet I saw that there's comment about this in the question and answer as well. So Margaret Patterson asks, is there any evidence of any Pict movement from Rosemarkie over to the other side of Moray Firth?
To the other side of the Moray Firth? Yes, I think probably the art historians would probably draw a connection, say, with the assemblage of stones at Drainey, which is now on display in the Elgin Museum. I think you could probably see connections between those and going up into Rosemarkie and that area. So it does suggest, and we've got quite, I think, again, a very tantalising connection in terms of a fragment from a shrine at Drainey that's very, very similar to the St Andrews, the so-called sarcophagus in St Andrews. So I think some kind of connection right up the eastern seaboard of Scotland is very probable, yeah.
So the next question that's been voted quite a bit, you'll see that's like small questions to answer. That's from Katie. First of all, she says, that was a great talk and I have a few questions. With the new theory that the blue stones at Stonehenge were taken with the people as they migrated, is there any evidence that people migrating within Pictland took their own stones with them? Could the Conan stone have originated in southern Pictland and have been taken north due to a movement in population?
I would say almost certainly, definitely not. Although I'm not a geologist and I don't think anyone has carried out any geological analysis, on a visual analysis, it is virtually identical to most of the other stones in the burial ground where it was found, and certainly to those medieval cross slabs, red sandstone with inclusions in them. So I think it is without a doubt locally sourced. I think what we probably have will be itinerant stone carvers, sculptors moving between churches, and certainly other movable objects that we've now lost. I mean, that's the other thing. We can only, you know, like the little kneeling figure with the animal mask, the only other example of that is from Murthly in Perthshire, but who knows what else that figure might have been portrayed in: manuscripts, carved wood, carved metalwork, all sorts of things that we have now lost. So I think objects were moved around, ideas were moved around. I'm not sure anybody's slinging a cross slab on a cart and moving up to the Highlands with it, no.
And actually, the second question that Katie is asking is quite intertwined with that first one, I think. Is anything known about how and where stonecarver were trained and how they moved around within Pictland? That's also a very vast question in itself. But what's your opinion?
Well, I mean, I think that's one of the theories, because the Pictish symbols are so remarkably uniform, is this notion of itinerant carvers wandering around. And I think certainly by the time we have Pictish monasteries, and it's very evident that we've got a stone carving workshop at Port Mahomack and probably one at Rosemarkie, and so those people are likely then going out and about and probably have a connection with Nig, with Shandwick, with Hilda Cadboll. As we spoke of earlier, connections between places like the monastery at Drainey on the Murray coast, and then up to Easter Ross. So I'm sure there were schools of sculpture. People would be trained there. People would be moving around and going off to carve something. I think almost certainly, again, this is just my opinion, I think almost certainly stones are more likely to be carved in situ rather than carved in a workshop, especially big things. So if stone carvers from a workshop are then travelling up into Sutherland to carve a stone for a church there, I don't think they're taking a finished piece with them. I think they're going up. We do have some evidence of stone being transported. Highland Perthshire, we've got stones in Highland Perthshire carved in fine grained sandstone, miles from anywhere where geologically you can find sandstone. So the sculptors were taking good material sometimes into areas where no good stone could be found. But I don't think they were moving finished stones around. I think it's too, without the use of slings and foam rubber, I think that would be too risky a business.
And one last question also from Katie, also very small question to answer. Is the positioning of the images on the Pictish stone important for the meaning?
Almost certainly. But what that meaning is, I certainly don't know. I'll leave it for our historians to pretend they do. I mean, to explain what it means for us. But yes, I don't think it's a random mishmash. It might look like that to us today, but they are almost certainly have a relevance, have a connection, and have an order and a hierarchy.
I would actually recommend also to Katie, if she's interested to learn more about this, to look into the book, The Art of the Picts, written now in 2004 by Isabel and George Henderson, that actually ask even more of these questions, but discuss a lot of those things. I'm just also giving a little reminder to the people who are asking questions that you can upvote for the question that you really would like, and that will push them up. So the next question, which had a lot of votes actually, is from Victoria Thompson, and she says, "Hi John, have you compared the biting beasts to those on the Bidstone hogback from Wirral?"
No, I haven't. But it certainly, after Anna sent me that picture of the Deerhurst one, it certainly drew my mind. One of the last groups of work that I worked on before retiring was the Govan hogbacks, and although they are very weathered and worn, the beasts that sort of surmount those and face each other at the gable ends are very, very toothsome, with big interlocking fangs, a little bit like what a crocodile's mouth does. And it certainly came to my mind that that's one of the kind of closer parallels. Whether we could infer from that that puts the Conan stone late and into that period of sort of Viking age hogbacks, like I say, I'll leave that for the art historians to argue. I'm not convinced of that myself, but that's certainly one theory.
Thank you. So the next question is from Roxanne Weddington Wild, and she asks, might some of the figures on the non-cross side of the slab be associated with each other visually as a tell a story? I'm thinking of the kneeling man facing the centaur while a dog wolf guards a herd of cattle, etc.
Yes, I mean, I think that's kind of like one of the earlier questions. There probably is some connection to these, rather than just being a jumble of disparate figurative carvings. I'm sure there will be connections, but what those connections would be, I have no idea. My job is to record it as clearly and as accurately as possible, and then hopefully that will enable other people to interpret as whether there's some kind of connection to a Bible story, to something like that, or whatever. Or
mythology that we don't know anymore. Yes. Or yeah.
Yeah.
Alistair Morton asks, the narrow sides interlaced decoration looks very Book of Durrow to me, possibly supporting an earlier date than the classic Easter Ross cross slabs, which are more Book of Kells. What do you think?
Well, certainly that chimes with what I kind of hinted at in the talk, is that I see what a potential reason for why the Conan stone has so little in common with its near neighbours is that I think it is probably a different date, and I would say more likely to predate rather than post-date the big establishment. So I think it's an earlier church that's established. When I say predate, I don't necessarily mean by centuries, but I think that my suspicion would be that it's earlier than the establishment of the big Pictish churches and monasteries on the coast, with influence coming in, perhaps just overland from the south. And so, yeah, that would be. I'm not that familiar with the ornament on the manuscripts, but certainly I shall have a look at Book of Durrow and see if I can see some parallels with that. That's a good pointer. Thank you for that.
Neil Robertson asked, with the monstrous heads on the crosshead give some impression of being predator skulls like bears. The dog on the other side has the same giant gnashers. What do you think? Do you also see parallels there?
Well, certainly, given that the teeth on the two beasts seem to have some anatomical correctness rather than the usual generic mouthful of fangs that you get. The possibility that they are depicting something like bears is, I think, is an interesting possibility. They're not overly bear-like, but it could still be that's what they represent. And again, that gives us an interesting parallel, bringing us back to one of the conventional beasts that guarded each end of a hogback stone. Many of them are bears or depictions thereof. So that's a possibility, yeah.
The following one, I'm just going as soon because there's still about 5 questions. We'll see how much we can answer. And I guess if we can't go through all of them just now, we can keep them for the big discussion after 4. But Alison Craig asked, is there any suggestion that the carving is done by more than one sculptor or filled in at different times?
Well, I'm not a stone. I dabble, but I'm not a stone carver, so I'm not sure about that. There's nothing overtly obvious on it to my eye that shows 2 different hands at work. And I don't know. I mean, again, there's so little of it that is well preserved. I think that would be a very difficult call to make. That might be easier for people to make that argument on a well-preserved example, that you could perhaps see 2 different hands at work. So I'm trying to think, actually. Yeah, I mean, there may be some examples elsewhere where you can see different hands at work. So Cynthia Thickpenny did her thesis on her PhD on key pattern, and she gave a talk to the Pictish Art Society once, looking at one of the panels from Rosemarkie. It's one of those kind of shrine side panels that's covered in key pattern, and you stand back and you look at it and it looks this perfect uniform thing, but actually, as she drew her attention to it, you can see that the pattern and the gap and the rhythm of the pattern changes from one end to the other. And that was one of the possibilities I think she raised, was, are we looking at somebody working starting from one end and a different hand working from the other end, and then having to merge in the middle and to basically do a bit of a mishmash on it. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know what evidence there is from other people examining better preserved stones as to whether more than one person worked on it or not.
Well, I'm afraid we have to stop here for this question and answer session, but please do keep your questions ready for when we have the final discussion after the next talk. And thank you so very much, John, for this. That was, of course, fantastic and very, very enjoyable. Thank you.